the narrative originally was like, you either have a trans kid or you have a dead kid. If those are my only two fucking options, Sasha, like obviously I'm picking whatever it is to keep my kid alive. And that's the most manipulative thing that I've ever heard in my whole life. Now, if I could share a personal detail as to why I think I care about this so much, is that back in 2018, I lost my big sister, Rachel, to suicide. And so if you like, and then, being with my parents and us, over the last 6 years trying to figure this out, watching my parents have to bury a child is the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my whole life. And so you're going to walk up to a parent of a 13-year-old, 14-year-old and say, you only have two options, dead or trans. Like you can't say, like, it's just horrible. Like to have that picture in your mind of like, okay, my kid is literally going to die. So they're going to kill themselves, or I just medicalize them. And so the idea that that's the only two options should like make people super skeptical just at the start of that. Like that can't be legit. Like there has to be another way for me to explore something about my child so they can be who they are. And I don't have to, think about these only two options. And so for me, that's like a really big deal, because obviously I know what it's like to lose someone that you love to suicide. And so when you threaten basically parents with that, there's got to be some ulterior motives that are having a driving force behind just, you think that this gender identity is what's good for the kid. That just doesn't make sense to me. And so I don't know what you think about that, but I have a sort of a soft spot or passion for that part.
Yeah, I read that about your sister before we started the show. And I'm so sorry that you and your family went through that. And I can totally understand why you'd have a radar go up upon hearing about that. The suicide threat, as it's become called, like, it is one of the most cult-like aspects of the trans affirmation movement. It is a real manipulation tactic. And I think what I've observed in my work with parents, I've consulted nearly 1,000 families now. And something that I've noticed is a couple things. First of all, when that threat, it's used, it used to be used all the time. I don't know if it's so common anymore, but this was a common refrain that gender clinics used to tell parents. So you're completely right about that. And what I've noticed is that there's kind of a couple of buckets of families. Families whose kids are actually not struggling with mental health issues. Maybe they're experimenting with this identity because their friends are, but it's like this fun, playful thing. Many of them, when they heard the suicide narrative, immediately were like, that sounds like total bullshit. Like, what are you talking about? My daughter's perfectly fine. So some people immediately realized that it's BS. Another bucket is like parents whose kids are genuinely having a mental health crisis. And this is often the context in which a trans identity emerges. So it's like a kid who was struggling with really serious eating disorder or self-harm or, all kinds of like mental health crises that landed them in like a psych hospital or something like that. And so understandably, those parents are already disoriented. They're desperate. Mm-hmm. They don't know what to do. They're already outsourcing, understandably, like, can you please help us help our kid? Because we don't know what to do. So they're particularly vulnerable to that message. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, the last bucket, I have worked with many families who did medicalize their children and maybe a few years later or even a few months later realized, oh, this magic promise of happiness has not come. Like, these puberty blockers are not helping. My child's worse now than ever before. And when I dig into those family backstories, there's almost always a suicide has happened in that family. So people who have that incredibly nightmarish lived experience of losing someone they love to suicide, like you said, it's a no-brainer. Anything that I can do to keep my kid alive, I will do it because my brother or my dad or somebody that I love died of suicide. So again, so manipulative, and it's so unethical to prey on families vulnerabilities, when in fact, and I mean, it would be different, Aaron, if we had tons of data that shows every time a kid is questioning their gender, that's the reason they're suicidal. And that if you affirm them, they'll stop being suicidal. I mean, if we had that data, I'd say, well, it's not a threat. It's a legitimate piece of clinical information, but it's not. All the research we have, there was a big study done in Sweden that followed people for 30 years. Gender dysphoria is not the reason that explains trans people's suicidality. It's always related to other mental health crises that they're having. And in fact, in a kind of ironic twist, trans women who are biological males have a much higher rate of suicide than females. And statistically, we know that males tend to have higher rates of completed suicide than females. So all of this just has to be grounded in reality. And people should never be manipulated into medicalizing their children.